Chapter 11, Keyframes. So this stage is very much pivoting between character poses in the design stage and the early blocking stage of animation, and getting us prepared for what is the starting line of production. Just want to give a general update of what has been happening this past month. So, as some of you may know, I had made two new independent short films, one being a 3-minute computer screen horror short, live action and animation combined, called Demo N, and a 15-second horror short called What the Hell Was That? Both these projects were originally made to be submitted in a few competitions, and I have been promoting them alongside while working on this project that this series is about. And lo and behold, both the projects have been getting positive responses from people in the industry so far. And just like with the response I got with my Burger Owl shorts 2 years ago now, has got me connected with a few more producers that I'm pleased to have as part of my network. I've also submitted both my short films through my Film Freeway accounts, and throughout the past week, I've had a few festivals approach me via my social media platforms, especially on my Instagram and my Twitter pages. I've also been updating my websites and also my YouTube channel, which I've been reorganizing my content and making it look a bit more professional, which leads to my last bit of news before I move on with delving into the main subject of this episode. This episode is the final episode of this season. Not quite the final. I plan to make one last episode just to wrap it up, but this is the last episode that covers the final stage of pre-production before moving on to production. And I thought I'd wrap this up as season 1 of my Instagram series that covers the entirety of this stage of my project. And then soon in the near future, I'll return with a second season where I'll be giving general updates of the film's progress in the production stage. There'll most likely be monthly episodes, as the production stage is very much where it becomes laborious. And also, one last detail is I'm going to be moving my Instagram series to my YouTube channel. The episodes I've done so far will remain on my Instagram series, but I also will be copying all these episodes of this season and uploading them onto my YouTube channel. And when I start a second season covering production, it will go on as a YouTube series instead. Reasons being is because I plan to make slightly more lengthier videos that surpass the limit that Instagram would allow me, and not having to keep on splitting videos into 2 pieces all the time whenever it surpasses the 20-minute limits. And in regards to gathering an audience, the number of followers that I've been getting throughout the past 4 months on here on my Instagram page has been pretty slow. And I don't really know why. It's something I'm still trying to figure out, but I'm only speculating that maybe I'll be able to get better results and reach out to more of an audience on YouTube rather than Instagram, to people who have similar interests, or reaching out to other like-minded folk who have a love for or work in film, animation, or students who may find value in this kind of content that they could learn from. And maybe that way, when I make more videos going forward through this platform, it'll hopefully reach out to a much broader audience. We'll see. Only time will tell, I guess. It will just be great to build a community around the work I produce and get some revenue out of this, just so that I can keep on creating my own content, whether it is creating my own short films or making tutorial videos or behind the scenes stuff, or even talk and analyze movies that I like that have inspired me. So let's go to the production pipeline just to see how far we have come in this series and where we are currently at in this stage. So the scripts obviously is done. We've done the thumbnails, then taken my storyboard frames and cutting it together into an animatic using Adobe Premiere Pro, and recently we've done the character designs and creating turnarounds using my own methodology, and that has trickled into doing the keyframes that act as the back end of the character design stage and touching onto the layout stage in production just by a bit. So I've been crossing over the character designs / character poses with Marty and using those poses as keyframes, blocking out the animation, and using them as a guide to help me when I'm doing the in-betweens. So this crosses over between design and dipping my toes into layouts just by a small margin. I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between these two departments. So now let's get into blocking the keyframes of the shots. So what I do is I use the shots, or a collection of shots here, from the animatic as the blueprints as a follow-through regarding helping me out with the timing, getting an accurate summation of how many frames are required to translate what is roughly shown here in the animatic. Using this piece of footage from the animatic, I can use this as a video reference, as a guide for blocking out the key poses and using the timing to know where to place the keyframes in the timeline, and that will determine how many frames in between those poses it takes that covers the entirety of the shot here. So what I do is I import a PNG image of one of the drawings in Marty's turnaround file, and also a storyboard frame of what he is doing in this shot from the animatic. Then I begin cutting around and drawing over certain parts of Marty and moving parts to very much try and match what he's doing in the storyboard frame. This is very much me showing you the methodology I did with my turnarounds, now utilizing this technique in when I'm animating. You know, I'm cutting around pieces and moving and warping areas, and then duplicating them over into another keyframe, doing the same thing over until I have a piece of animation, and then keep on tweaking it until it feels right, and start breathing life into the character in a way. Cut around his head and rotate it back. So I'm going to cut around, warp, and redraw areas of his face to the facial expression like he is in the storyboard frame. Fill in these blank areas where I've cut and moved pieces of this drawing. I'm going to angle him a bit and have him leaning back and position his shoulders and arms in a way it looks like that he's pulling onto something. So that's the first keyframe here. This is his final pose. Then I'm going to the keyframe at the start of the timeline with him leaning forward and hunched over as the starting pose, leading into himself leaning his back to the final pose that you just see me do. I'm going to cut around and do some warping and angling of the head, get the head shaped right, and the proportions of his features looking in a way that he has tilted his head slightly down. Have the shoulders slouched down here. Get a bit more back here so that it looks more like he's hunched over. Do a bit of cleanup with the line work with all the fiddling I've been doing here. Okay, that's it. And now the last keyframe I need to do in the shot is the mid pose of him at the halfway point of the journey of his body leaning back. So I'm going to duplicate this keyframe and place it in the keyframe that perfectly times the speed and distance of this action. Cut around and move him up a bit, warp his fringe here and have him positioned in a way that his hair is swishing forward to convey some clarity to the speed of his movements. You know, make it a bit more dynamic. Pieces of his jacket here swaying forward too. Clean it up a bit. Let's just swipe through the timeline to see how the keyframes convey the action clearly. And here I'll keep going back and forth and warping areas of these drawings until the block out of this action is clear. Yeah, I think it looks about right. Okay, let's block out the keyframes for the next shot, which is Selma. And the same I did with Marty. I import a PNG of a drawing from Selma's turnaround file, use a piece of footage from the animatic as reference to block out the timing and the number of frames between each key pose in this shot, and I use a still image of what she's supposed to be doing in this shot, which is her struggling to pull the suitcase out of the boot of the car. Now, since this short film will be 2D animation interacting with 3D space, I've imported and cut out an image of a 3D suitcase and enlarged and angled it to where the camera will be in the shots, and have it interact with what Selma is doing. Going to disassemble this drawing and work on the individual pieces and have them pose in a way she would be in the shot. Going to work on her torso, position it leaning forward, splay her arms out. So I'm going to focus on her head and cut and warp and redraw areas of her face and achieve the expression based on the storyboard frame here. Latching onto the suitcase, reposition and leaning forward. Creating the illusion of her torso bent over, leaning towards the camera, took a bit of trial and error and involved a mix of my methodology of cutting and warping with redrawn areas to achieve that angle that it's believable that she's leaning forward. Yeah, clean up the lines, final tweaks here. So this keyframe is her final pose, and now like with Marty, I'm going to duplicate this drawing and place it in the first keyframe in the timeline and have her arched inwards as her starting pose, which leads into her arching herself outwards into the finishing pose. So I'm going to put her head on a bit of an angle. Her locks will be hanging down here, and the back of her hair we can see slightly. I'm just going to rest on her shoulder here. Gonna arch her back. Yeah, as you can see, as I'm working on this character, she's a bit fiddly with everything that's going on here. I'm figuring out the placements of where I'm cutting and moving the pieces of the artwork and warping it enough until the posing looks right here. Do a bit of fixing. This is just a lot of tweaking I'm doing here. You know, I'm just filling in bits of missing information from all the fiddling I'm doing with this drawing. Yep, and now the final keyframe is the mid pose. With this shot, she kind of shoots herself up like a spring and falls to her final pose. So this mid pose is also an additional pose that she does before snapping to that final pose that we did at the start of this shot. Her locks kind of violently swish in midair here, and the hair from behind kind of sways forward, almost like a curtain is being pulled open. Yep, letting the missing pieces of the drawing here, clean up some of the line work. And what I'm going to do is duplicate this drawing and place it a few frames ahead of the final drawing, and then duplicate the final pose and place that ahead of this drawing. You'll see why I did that. So now the mid pose I've duplicated here, I'm going to cut around and angle her torso slightly more up and rotate her head back, raise her hair up in the air more, and then this will lead into her snapping back into the duplicated final pose I put a few frames ahead of this. So when I swipe through the keyframes, it looks like she violently arches her way up and then falls into that pose. This requires a bit of fiddling and going back and forth between these drawings, especially with her secondary actions happening here, like her head of hair and her hips slightly too. So I'm just going to speed through this so you can see my point of what I'm getting at much sooner here. Yep, let's swipe through these keyframes, do some tweaks here. The actions are beginning to make sense here with what I've done with these keyframes for this shot so far. Now I'm going to go to the next shot, which is shot 30. Looking at this shot from the animatic as reference here, yeah, this one has almost all the characters in one shot here. So what I'm going to do is divide the keyframing of this shot into two and focus on Marty and Selma in this shot, continuing to pull the suitcase out of the back of the car, timing their poses based on how I've timed it in the animatic here. And then I'll create a duplicated version of this anim file on my Procreate with the same number of keyframes and have that focus on what Danica and Jackson are doing. And then in post, I'll composite them together in my CG environment on Blender, and the timings of the two PNG image videos should work out perfectly. Another reason why I've decided to do it like this is because Procreate can only take on so many layers in one file. If you throw in too many grouped layers, Procreate will refuse to allow you to add any more layers once you've reached the maximum amount that it can manage. So I'm just importing the suitcase, a still of the CG vehicle that's going to be in the film as placement for the suitcase that both Selma and Marty are interacting with in this shot. Import the PNGs of the drawings of Marty and Selma from the turnaround files. Start posing them and adding the number of keyframes needed for this shot, along with, some tweaks here and there. I mean, what more can I say about this, really? I find this overall scene hilarious, actually. This shot before this is a very eerie opening and pretty atmospheric and builds tension, and then we whip pan to two close-ups of a guy and a girl squirming and grunting that leaves to the imagination to wonder, only to find in a wide shot that they're struggling to pull a suitcase. And not even Marty, who's this hench jock character, can't yank it out of there. I feel having gone through these three shots, there's always been a challenge that I've come across with the choices of software I'm using for this project, the methodology that is being utilized and blocking out the poses. And sometimes it's tedious, and sometimes can be agonizing when you're trying to figure out the creative problems. But overall, I find it pretty fun and exciting being left to figure it out. And once you do figure it out, it becomes a personal achievement and a sense of growth and mastering your own craft and taking ownership of it. Every endeavor I've come across, whether it was a short film, short documentary, or an animated piece, I've learned so much about the craft. It feels like I'm pushing myself and finding new ways and new challenges that come my way unintentionally. And as I've worked on them and learning from these experiences to bettering myself as a filmmaker and a visual storyteller. So once I've blocked out the keyframes of these shots, I then start applying the in-betweens, which is the beginning of the animation stage and the starting point of production, which concludes the entirety of what I wanted to cover for this season of my series so far. I hope you've enjoyed the journey so far, seeing the development of my latest production here. So, like I said at the start, I have one more episode left that I want to make to pretty much wrap everything up for this season, covering everything you need to learn about this project in pre-production, and my approach to making an independent short film overall. So, in the next episode, I would like to talk in length more about what's happening in my life and what the next steps are for me going forward, as well as some more announcements that I'm excited to share with you all about. So until next time, see you all in episode 12, the final episode of the season. Same bloody time, same bloody channel.